Okay, so we'll kick off the June 22nd PVC meeting. It's recorded now. We'll start with the first agenda item, which is approve the minutes. Do I have anybody to put forth a motion to approve the last meeting minutes?
Mr. Chairman, I'll move that the minutes of the June 9th, 2020 meeting be approved as submitted.
Thank you, Richard. Do I hear a second?
Second.
George, thank you. Any questions? Hearing, seeing none, coming to a vote. All in favor, say aye. I will go down the list. Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Erwin?
Aye.
Jean?
Aye.
Natasha?
Aye.
And Stuart, the chair, says aye as well. Great. Okay. Before we start the next agenda item, let's just make sure I don't see anybody else from the attendees from the PVC team.
I think Roy said he was coming.
I say again, George?
Didn't Roy say he was going to be attending?
I thought
Yes.
so too, and there he is. Can you promote him, Roger? Roy Schiffelty is on the bottom of the list.
Yep.
We'll wait till Roy's in. Okay, it looks like Roy is in. Okay, great, excellent. All right, so we have a full committee tonight. We have three agenda items. We've got the Emory Grover building study, just to sort of dot the i's across the t's, final report. Then we have the school master plan, which is a big part of tonight's meeting, and to review where we are there and next actions. And then just two small items in other business. Is there any questions about the agenda before we go to the Emory Grover topic? Okay, and because tonight's a different format, meaning it's a webinar, it's got panelists, which everybody sees themselves. There are people as attendees that are not on video nor voice. If there's anybody that's in the attendee list that is not promoted to panelists because of the topic, that's okay. It's just those attendees. If you want to raise a question, you need to raise your hand. There is a mechanism to do that in the bar as a attendee, and then we will get that. We also, I think, Roger, we do have a chat window as well. Am I correct?
No, we don't. Just everything is by raised hand and questions.
Raised hand. So for everybody's benefit, any questions, please raise your hand. For the panelists, which are the people on the video, in current video, just like we normally do in these meetings, raise your hand on the electronics or wave your hand, or I'll potentially see the eyes going with questions. But the format as expected, the presentation by the presenters, and then we'll go to questions and answers, and then any voting items. Okay. Any questions relative to format for the meeting?
Stuart, Hank is asking to be elevated to panelist at this time.
Yeah, that's fine, because he's going to be in. He's in with the group and also the Emory Grover too. So
Yeah.
But any questions in terms of before we move to the Emory Grover and then move the team for the Emory Grover into the panelist? Okay, I don't see any major. Okay, so with that, we'll move to the Emory Grover. Hank, are you going to lead the Emory Grover piece?
Yes, certainly.
And do we need to promote anybody in the attendees to this list?
There should be Reese
Okay,
and Joel.
I don't see Joel. Do you?
Joe may not be on.
Okay, so we have Reese on. Is there anybody else, Hank, that needs to be
No, Reese would be the only one.
Okay.
Then.
I'm here.
Great.
Oh, good.
Okay.
And we distributed the final draft to the full committee. We also sent it out to the working group. And I've had a chance to do another review. I have a few minor edits that are necessary, but we were really putting this on the agenda to see if there was any specific comments coming back from the committee so that those comments could be incorporated into the final report.
From the committee, is there any questions, comments relative to the report?
Question.
George?
Were you going to put together a kind of a summary of the committee's thoughts about the project? Or are we going to just let it be as it is?
Is that a question to me or Hank?
Well, I guess to either one.
So
In other
the-
words, are we going to offer comment on any favorability that we have of one over the other, or whether or not this, when this should proceed and how important it is time-wise to not let this just go and kind of fade away because there's no budget money. Are you going to offer any thoughts?
we wrote a forward or a letter, George, and we probably should have had that shared, Hank,
Well,
but
It's in the, Stuart, it is in the last
it was
draft.
in the packet, right?
Oh, it was in the last pack. I'm sorry. I didn't think it got in there. Okay.
Okay, good. But just the essence of it, George, was a recap of what was done and really at the end of the recommendation in terms of go forward steps. Hank, do you want to add anything to that? Or Steve?
Yeah, I think that the user group, the school committee, and the school department need to take the report and
Actually, Hank, I'm sorry. I apologize. Dan is on Gudikants. I'm not sure if he wants to be promoted to this group or not.
I think he should be promoted.
Yes. Can you do that, please? Roger, take Dan and promote him to panelist. Thank you. Sorry, Dan.
Thanks, I'm here.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Hank or Steve.
the only thing that we'll be adding of substance is an acknowledgement appendix. So it'll list the people on the working group, the people on the PBBC, and the members of the school committee. I think that the report is then transferred over to the superintendent and the school committee to begin the process of sorting out next steps. And we have already discussed some of those with the superintendent, i.e. returning to the CPC, returning to the Historic Commission, getting any comments or steps forward from them, and eventually returning to the planning board to draft up language for the zoning bylaw change. It would also entail return trips to Finance Committee for discussion about the funding.
Yeah, I also would like to add that within the framework of those people, the school committee should be seriously thinking about a non-binding referendum at the fall town meeting to move this project along. And so I think that's part of the next steps as well.
Steve, we've not done that before, have we?
We have not. This was a suggestion that was made at the chair's meeting.
Well, Steve, I think that it was done, they mentioned that it was done for town hall.
Town hall, yep.
Was it? Okay.
And so they were suggesting a similar approach just to make sure that there was support with the direction and the addition renovation of the existing building.
But at this juncture, the suggestion coming at least from our department is that the next steps really need to be brought forward by the school department and the school committee on moving the project to the next level. We can, of course, we will support any discussion that takes place via comments and content within the report. But that is the next, in my mind, the next logical place where this project needs to be forwarded. Dan, do you agree with that?
Mr. Chair, members, yes, I do. And I just want to thank Joel and Reese and team for a good report. I think it's been embellished and enhanced since we last talked about it. I think Steve and I laid out what is appropriate to have happen next. The school committee is meeting on July 14th. And I will make sure that before that date, but certainly by the 14th, that they have a opportunity for this to be part of their meeting, if not for a full discussion, at least for preliminary discussion. And also, I know that we need to provide a copy, which I'll do after I've shared it with the school committee, to the CPC, because we also told them that we would forward them a final copy with some of the information they had requested, and I believe that's included. So with appreciation, yes, I agree with these next steps, and I appreciate Stephen Hanks and everyone's work to get to this point.
Well, if it's okay with you, Dan, we will issue the report with a June 2020 date by the end of the month, and probably by the end of this week, possibly, or certainly by the end of the month. And we will distribute it to all the key departments. And then I would expect that you would follow up with the specifics.
Okay. George, you had your hand raised. Is that your earlier question?
Well, it was part of it, but I wanted to ask Dan specifically. Dan, what do you see as the sentiment in the school committee at this point in time in terms of supporting this effort as we move forward? Do you see a strong sentiment? Obviously, there are other commitments for funding, and no one's decided where we're going to get the funds for this, even including CPC. So thoughts about that?
Before you go forward, Susan Neckes is in the attendee. Is that somebody that we should have join? She should be joined into this, correct?
She certainly can be, because she's a member of the school committee. She is the rep for the facility study. Matt Spangler is the rep for the EG, but Sue is well-versed in all these projects and absolutely.
Okay. I just think, because Sue, you'll be in the next one, but I figured I'd ask if you want to be in this one, given the question.
She would have an opinion for sure.
Yeah, I thought it was appropriate, so thank you. Sorry, George. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I'll let Sue can decide whether or not she wants to speak. I don't want to speak for the school committee, except to say that they have for a long time advocated for the Emory Grover building. Rather, I should say, advocated for the school administration to be renovated, and I think there's a strong desire for this project to move forward. I also think the school committee recognizes that the with the facility study, that there are some sobering conversations that need to take place in town to move the appropriate projects forward at the right time and pace. So yes, there's support for this project, and there's support for the next discussion item. Sorting all of that out is the work of many town boards and town meeting.
Right, all collectively.
Thank you.
Sue?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with everything Dan just said. I think that this project is so long in waiting. I think we all know the deficiencies of Emery Grover, and people have had to put up with really difficult working conditions for a long time. So I hope that we can certainly address that and the other facility issues. But I do know that money is a concern and funding will be the big question. So I support what Dan had to say.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? We have one voting item, but anything that we need to close out? I think, Steve, you already made the conclusion in terms of getting this report out with BHNA. We'll have a June date. By the end of the month, hopefully we'll have it in their hands. Okay. I see no questions, nothing electronic. Okay, great. We have one voting item on Emery Grover, which is an invoice for BHA's May services for $7,000. Put that forth for a approval. Do I hear a second?
Second.
George? Okay, any questions? Hearing none, coming to a vote on 7,000. All in favor, and I'll read the names. Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Erwin?
Aye.
Roy?
Aye.
Jean?
Aye.
Natasha?
Aye.
Stewart's and I. And Dan, you're a member of the working group. Representative, right?
But not
Thank you.
not a voting member for this particular project.
I thought you were okay. Fair
Susan.
enough. We're good. Ceremonial vote, how's that?
Oh, no.
Are we all set, Hank, for anything else that's?
Yeah, I was mistaken. It's Matt Spangler who's the representative for this.
Right.
And Angelotti.
Okay. Oh, Ann is on. Should we have had Ann promoted into panelist, Hank?
I think that's a good idea because she'll also be involved in the next discussion.
Okay, can you just promote Ann? And then Ann, I don't know if you heard the vote and want to voice your vote. You're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
I did hear, and yes, I vote aye.
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, then that is everything for Emery Grover. And the next item is the school master plan. And I think, Hank, you're going to lead that, but before we go too far logistically, we want to make sure, if I'm not mistaken, we've got Andrea, Don, Jason, and others that need to come in, correct?
Jason Boone, yes.
Okay.
Don Walter.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
If it's possible, I'm not sure if she wants to, but Andrea Longo Carter, chair of the school committee, is observing the meeting, and at some point she may or may not want to offer something, but if it's possible to promote her.
If there's no objections from the group, I think we should promote her in.
Good idea.
Okay, thank you. And then anybody else that needs to come in, Hank or others?
Let's see. You have Don Walter, Jason Boone. Is Michelle Rogers signed on?
Yes, Michelle's there. Yes, get Michelle in.
She could be promoted as well, please.
Okay, great. She must have the deck because look what happened.
I think Jason will probably start this off.
Oh, Jason's got it. Okay. Do you want to just lay out the expectation here, Hank, in terms of the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes?
Okay. As you recall, during our last meeting with the committee a month ago, there were a variety of options that were presented. And those options included the status quo, included a a 6 through 8 middle school at Pollard, with renovations at Mitchell, and also reuse of the High Rock School as an elementary school. And then there were also options that entailed converting 2 schools, Newman and Pollard, to 5 to 8 schools. So all of these selected options were then put forward for preliminary pricing at a feasibility level to assess the relative cost and value associated with each of those options. And also, Doran Whittier looked at the timing and the sequence of what could happen, and in essence, you'll see that schedule and those cost estimates this evening. You'll also see issues about most of the cost estimates, all of the cost estimates started with 2020 funding or 2020 cost, and they are then escalated according to the schedule. And we don't know what that schedule will be, but eventually there will be escalation costs associated with those, each of those projects, depending on which option is selected. So Jason, if that is adequate, I think I'll turn it over to you and let you walk us through that presentation.
If I may, Hank and Jason, just to make sure. Jason, you're going to present some information. I presume I'll offer it up. We want to wait till you get through the discussion before we ask questions, or is it best to ask questions through this?
I think we're flexible either way. The sequences of the projects are nuanced enough that it might be appropriate to just pause and ask questions as they arise as we move through the presentation. But I leave that to your discretion, Stuart.
Okay, and just for everybody's benefit, because the presentation's up, I might have a little bit more difficulty. I see about 6 people in the screen, and then I have to scroll over. So if you desperately want to raise a question, if you don't hear, maybe just just make a voice comment. But I think according to what Jason's saying, it's probably better to get through the nuances and then go for the questions.
And Stuart, I should also point out that there have been some minor adjustments since it was distributed on Friday. And so following this discussion, we will update the committee with the final presentation that's given tonight.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Hank. As he mentioned, we essentially have 2 main topics tonight, going over sort of how we built the cost estimates that you're going to see in the cost estimates themselves, and then the sequences of the projects that we've talked about in the 4 remaining master plan scenarios that we're still exploring. We'll conclude this evening with a few next steps and timing related to the draft report and such. So the preliminary cost estimate assumptions first. We wrote these out mostly for the record. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going over all of the details in these cost estimates, except to say that they started out as essentially cost per square foot estimates for both building and site, based on preliminary programming, based on some layout sketches that we've done, and then some arithmetic has been added to those cost per square foot estimates based on what you see here on the next 2 slides. For example, all of the renovated square footages have been categorized into one of 3 buckets: a light renovation, a medium renovation, or heavy renovation, based on the conceptual layout work that we've done to date. We've assumed, for example, that all of the projects are executed using the construction manager at risk methodology, right? That's something that can be adjusted if the town or the PBBC thinks that we should make a different assumption around how to deliver each one of these projects. But all of them are based on the appropriate markups associated with a CM at risk. There are a number of contingencies built into the cost estimates, percentages that have been worked out with with Hank and Steve and applied at the appropriate moment in the cost estimating algorithm. There are placeholders for furniture, fixtures, and equipment. There are placeholders for OPM, designer fees, and other soft costs that get included in the total project cost. And then, as Hank said at the outset, there's basically two types of costs that we'll be reporting tonight. One is in 2020 dollars, so that we can simply compare them apples to apples. And another one that escalates each one of the projects based on where they fall in their relative master plan sequence. So perhaps I should just pause here because I know there's a lot of information related to how we built these estimates. Are there any specific questions about the underlying assumptions?
I don't see any questions.
And we can always come back to this at the end if questions arise.
I do have a quick one. Why did you make I know it provides a conservative estimate, but why did you assume that we would go with CM at risk?
A lot of that had to do with the size and complexity of particularly the work at Pollard. When there's phased, occupied construction, it often makes sense to go the CM at risk route. Like we said, we could certainly adjust that assumption as necessary, but that was the reason we picked CM at risk as an assumption for all of these projects.
Okay, that's still, I guess that's a decision we'd have to make, but that's always questioned whenever we do that, and we have to have good reasons for why. I think Pollard is a good example of some complexities there that probably would lend themselves more to CM at risk than a guaranteed price. But anyway, we'll have to decide that later. But this is actually going to give you a more a higher price.
Certainly.
Okay. Steve, you agree that's a good thing to go with right now?
Yeah, I think as a baseline, we should keep it at this. It's a little bit more conservative. Certainly if Mitchell might be a consideration to go the other way, but for now, I think it's fine to use this as a baseline.
Okay.
So the next thing we're going to walk through is the sequences themselves. And much like the cost estimate, there are assumptions cooked in here, like which project would be an MSBA project, which project would potentially the town take on their own. And those assumptions can certainly be challenged between now and when the study is published. But I'll talk about each one of those assumptions and why as we work through these. So all of these sequences are graphically set up the same. So you'll see the name of the scenario in the upper left-hand corner. You'll see the projects to be executed in the master plan, sort of with the little tiles in the upper right-hand corner. So for the status quo scenario, this is a 4-project master plan, something at Mitchell, something at High Rock, something at Pollard, and then the need for a temporary elementary school because of how the sequencing is working. Major milestones are marked for each project, and then the fully escalated cost estimate is what you're seeing associated with each one of the projects. So in this particular scenario, the assumption is that things would start next year and that Mitchell would be an MSBA project that starts by submitting a statement of interest to the MSBA early in 2021 and concluding around the spring of 2027. The key moments in the Mitchell project align with some of the key moments in the temporary elementary school project based on earlier feedback that we've received from the town. It appears that it's preferable to have students off-site during construction. So the timing of the temporary project, which would need to start with a vote to fund designer services in November of 2022 and conclude around April of 2023, 25. The critical moment is one of them is in November of 2023, where the vote to fund the MSBA project from schematic design through occupancy needs to align with the vote to fund construction for the temporary project. The logic in that is you wouldn't want to commit to the temporary project financially without having assurances that there's funding for the main MSBA project. The consequence of that is that the MSBA project is actually a little longer than it really needs to be, because you need the temporary project to be finished in order to occupy it during the roughly 2 years of construction of the MSBA project. So while all of that's going on, in order to address the capacity issues at High Rock, there's a proposed addition at High Rock that would start in the spring of 2021 and be occupied around the fall of 2023. So 3 projects, capital projects going on concurrently in this particular scenario to solve the issues that have been identified as part of the master plan study. The assumption about the Pollard project is that it would come after and could potentially also be an MSBA project. The timing that's depicted here is that the submission of a statement of interest for that project would occur earlier in the year, just as the Mitchell project is wrapping up. So that's sort of an idealized sequence of 2 back-to-back MSBA projects. Of course, there's no guarantee that the MSBA would invite you in 2 immediate projects back-to-back like that, but we've set the sequence in that way to demonstrate that the fastest you could complete this master plan is about 139 months at a total cost for the entire master plan escalated of around $310 million. So again, I'll pause here and see if there are any questions about this particular sequence.
Any questions? I have a question, but is there any questions from on board? Question I have is from an MSBA standpoint. Do we know what the contribution could be?
Well, if we take the Sunita Williams School as an example, the theoretical value is 34% roughly. However, with all of the exclusions and caps and other things, I think we could only anticipate about a 25% reimbursement. And the total cost of the temporary modulars would be borne by the town. That is a non-reimbursable expense.
So of the expenses that they would reimburse, are you saying 25% of total costs or 25% of what could be in the bucket to reimburse?
I guess I'd say approximately 25% of total costs because they will reimburse for the total design expenses, for the total OPM expenses, and various of the soft costs, but they'll be more limiting in terms of the reimbursement for construction costs. I think also we're seeing a lot of competition from other towns in terms of getting accepted into the MSBA program. And so I would view this as an optimistic approach and schedule. And then finally, there's the question the town asked on the Sunita Williams project, they tried to get the override vote tied into a presidential year so that the town meeting and the following vote to override would potentially have the largest turnout. So that in and of itself might delay things until November 2024.
Okay, I've got a question from Richard and Natasha. Richard, I think you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Jason, I think I'm having a kind of a hard time with the concept of temporary elementary school what exactly does that mean? Is that a cluster of modulars? What exactly does that entail? How does it differ qualitatively? I know it's kind of an obvious question, but how does it differ qualitatively from a full-fledged permanent structure? And the second part of my question is the cost estimate that has been developed for a temporary building. Does that include dismantling the building at the end of its use? Two questions there.
Yeah, maybe I'll let Michelle handle the second question. The first question, the qualitative question, this temporary elementary school project that we've had estimated is a series of modular classrooms essentially strung together. In this case, with a little bit of permanent construction for a multi-purpose room that could serve during educational use as a gymnasium, as a cafeteria, as a meeting space. But in this $40.5 million, there are only classrooms and special education spaces. There's no necessarily an art room or no music room. There's no library. So qualitatively, it would be similar inside the classroom, but very dissimilar in terms of dedicated space for certain programmatic elements. It's an effort to minimize the amount of square footage necessary to survive a couple of years during construction.
Just to
Michelle?
answer,
Thank you.
yeah, just to answer your question about taking the building down, it was not factored into this, but we did factor that portion of the temporary facilities as being permanent, although modular construction, it would be permanent. So that gymnasium cafeteria space would then stay on to be a multifunctional, probably gymnasium space as you move forward. And then you would have to pay to remove the remaining portions of the building once you decided that you no longer needed any other swing space for the rest of the town.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Hank? I'm going to go to Natasha.
Yeah, I believe that they had also included the upgrades necessary to make the parking lot at DeFazio compliant, paved and with the associated infiltration. And the town, as we experienced with the Newman project, found that the lease of the modulars was a greater cost benefit than the purchase of the modulars. So that in that lease, the lease could also stipulate at the termination of that lease what is removed and what is left behind.
That's correct. And we also included, in addition to the parking lot, we included the laid down space, which was the taking over of one of the fields, and then the reestablishment of that field as well.
Thank you. Roger, could you lower Richard's hand and then we'll go to Natasha?
So my question is, so 106.5 million for Mitchell, right, is total project cost, including a CM at risk, is what I understand. So what was the final total project cost for Sunita Williams? Is it comparable to this, except you added, I mean, did it end up being similar to this and then with escalation?
Well, first of all, Sunita Williams is a 4-section school.
Okay.
So 4 classes per grade level. The total construction cost, or I should say project costs, there was land acquisition and of about 7 million. And the total project costs are coming in at about 48 million, of which about a quarter, a little less than a quarter, will be reimbursable. And none of the acquisition costs are reimbursable.
So if it was 40-something million, 48 million for the construction cost, what is estimated for construction costs for a 5-section?
That number is total cost, I believe.
Yes.
Yes. So the construction cost is in the 38.5 million range. Whereas the number you're looking at here.
Why is this higher?
Yeah, the number you're looking at here is the total project costs. So that number, and I think if we do go to the Excel spreadsheet that Doran Whittier previously distributed, and maybe we'll go back to this at the conclusion, you can see a breakdown of hard costs, soft costs, and escalation. And the escalation
Is
is,
it compared to Sunita Williams or it's not?
Well, I just want to say that this building, Sunita Williams, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Hank, is about 96,000 square feet, or maybe a little bit less than that. And so this building is considerably larger than the Sunita Williams.
Right, but proportionately is what I was thinking, right? Because proportionately, just to understand, are we in the same budget as Sunita Williams, knowing that there's escalation and that there's a proportion?
Right,
Or-
and then the second part is the escalation at 5%, I think is what we used.
4.5.
4.5.
4.5, and we took it out to the midpoint of construction, which brings you, you know,
The 2020.
back out to like September of 2026. So you're escalating quite a bit.
Yeah.
So we went, to help you, Natasha, in 2020 dollars, the cost, the comparable cost is 86 million versus the 106. So considering this is a bigger school and it's 2020 dollars instead of 2018 dollars, I think they're in the ballpark.
Okay. Thank you.
George?
Yes. I think in order to be conservative, the reality is that 25%, Hank, is probably going to be closer to 20% in the future. We've never gotten 34%. It's a complete misnomer to say that to anybody that we have, because we never get that. It's more like in the low 20s, and I don't think it's going to go higher in the future. So if I were estimating at this point, I would not estimate more than 20% reimbursement from MSBA rather than 25% even. It's just the reality that the rich get poorer as time goes on, because there are so many towns that are looking for money, and we're not going to be ones that are favored in terms of getting a lot of contribution from that. That's my opinion. I don't know what Doran Whittier's feelings are on that, but we've never gotten favorable treatment when it comes to that, because we are a relatively wealthy town.
Certainly the net reimbursement percentage is always significantly lower than the baseline MSBA reimbursement percentage. But even with that said, I think the important thing to stay focused on here is sort of the comparative nature of these cost estimates, one scenario to the other, because the total costs actually vary quite widely depending on the nature of each of the master plan scenarios themselves.
I don't disagree with that, but I didn't want our estimates to show something that we've never gotten, and I don't think we will get in the future.
Well, we're not,
George,
we're not showing MSBA reimbursements. I think the point that Jason just made, that we're trying to stack up the different scenarios so that you can see the relative cost, not the cost, but the relative costs of one project to the other. And I think we ought to stay focused on that and not start to look at.
I totally agree. Totally agree.
Okay.
So these next two scenarios are very similar.
Oh, hold on one second. Hey, Steve, could you just put your phone on mute? For some reason it has a little bit of a tick to it.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, go ahead, Jason.
These next two scenarios are very similar. The main difference between them is the size of the Mitchell project and how the High Rock facility is being used at the conclusion of the scenario. So what's being depicted here is both a Pollard project and a Mitchell project moving forward concurrently, where the Mitchell project is assumed to be the MSBA project, starting with a statement of interest in February of 2022 and concluding in the fall of 2027. The Pollard project, in order to get the timing right, starting in the fall of next year with a town vote to fund the feasibility, and then concluding in the fall of 2025. Like we talked about with the temporary elementary school in the previous scenario, the timing of the occupancy of the Pollard project is critical so that the High Rock facility can be used as swing space for the Mitchell project. And you see a tiny little High Rock project squeezed in there the summer before the Pollard project opens to get it ready for that use as swing space. So what would happen is students would move into the High Rock facility as an elementary school in the fall of 2025. The Mitchell site would be free of students for 2 years of construction. And then at the conclusion of this, all of the students would move back to the Mitchell property, and High Rock would be discontinued for educational use. So essentially in this scenario, you're building a larger Mitchell project in order to have High Rock available for other purposes. The duration in this case is much shorter, around 70 months, and a total escalated cost of around $287 million for both projects, or all three projects actually. So again, I'll pause here. Is there any questions about this sequence?
Can I just ask a silly question? I was just looking at it. You got 120,000 square feet in Mitchell, brand new construction, 111. So that's about $925 a square foot, right? You got Pollard that has a 134,000 square foot reno, which would be a different price. But then if you take the 80,000 square foot addition, you could just combine them for giggles. As an average, you come down to about $800 a square foot. Is there anything, we don't spend a lot of time, I'm just curious, is there a lot of difference in the Pollard set of numbers that you have to contend with versus the brand new stuff with Mitchell?
If I understand what you're asking, Stuart, we generated a renovation number for the Pollard project based on the extent of the renovation. So for example, we know there's a science issue that has to be solved. Part of the solution to that science issue is reconfiguring walls inside the existing Pollard building, and that's priced out at a higher renovation cost than, let's say, the library, which is conceptually going to remain intact and only get, systems replacement like the entire building would. So what we don't have in this scenario is the cost of Pollard at all new construction. It's in the Excel document as a separate line item, and it's an even higher total project cost than Pollard as an ad reno.
Right.
So the total cost per square foot for an all new building is going to be higher than the nature of the renovation that we're projecting at Pollard. If that answers your question.
Yeah, I just curious, a couple of different perspectives. I mean, the other question would be what's the cost of the addition in Pollard versus the addition in Mitchell, but I won't go there. I mean, I'd just like to understand some of the pieces outside of this, but there are two questions beyond myself, and I'm not sure who pulled their hand up first, so I apologize. I'll just go down the order I can see. Is Natasha, you've got a question, and then Dan has a question.
I guess this is for Dan and for the school committee. Is there an advantage of a 6th through 8th versus a 6 separate and 7 and 8th? I mean, I ended up having both of my kids have 6 separate than 7 than 8th, but I know that at one point you talked that there was an advantage of putting them back together. I don't have an opinion. I just wanted to know what you guys thought. What's better for the schools?
Mr. Chair, I would let Sue maybe answer that, and then I'm happy to complement her answer with.
Sure, I'm happy to start that conversation. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so you know, if I, not being the educator, have that conversation with our principals at High Rock and Pollard, they would say that there would be, you know, they've done a really good job of managing a separate 6th grade center from a 7 and 8, but they would definitely see some positives in combining them. So for some students, certainly our special ed students, but even some other students, having, you know, those back-to-back transition years is difficult. And so in that case, you know, we also have a situation where the principal and staff at High Rock are just getting to know the kids really, really well a few months before they're leaving to go on to another school. And in addition, there is some staff sharing and busing issues and things like that that would be much easier to manage and more efficient if they were all in the same school. So I'll start there, and maybe Dan can pick it up from there.
You know, I think everything, Sue kind of captured everything.
Okay, Natasha, you all set?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Dan, I'll turn to you. You had your hand up.
Just a quick, and I think I should have caught this before, and I apologize, but the $300,000 set aside for renovating bathrooms presumably is to make them elementary bathrooms. Is that correct, Jason?
Yes. So that's currently a placeholder. We actually haven't done the field work yet to measure those to see if that's actually necessary, but we have that money in there as a placeholder in case it's necessary.
Okay. I don't believe it is necessary. I believe we had this conversation when we designed the building that those are elementary bathrooms. The only exception would be if we had to do something for kindergarten. So I don't know that should change this. It's obviously a small component of it, but I don't think that those dollars would be necessary.
Dan, if I may, we would have to change the fixtures in the bathroom.
Okay.
There is a small cost. Whether 300,000 covers that or more than covers it, I don't know. But
and why would they have to be changed, Steve?
The fixtures were not. The fixtures for the younger grades aren't there. We just have the older grade capability within the bathroom fixtures. And once you,
it's nothing. It's just something to investigate further. I believe they were specifically designed for grades 1 through 5. But it's a small piece that can be obviously investigated later.
Okay.
Any other questions, Stuart?
I see no other questions, Jason, so go ahead.
So this next scenario graphically is identical. The difference is what happens with the High Rock project at the conclusion of the master plan and the size of the Mitchell project that you're executing. Remember, this is a scenario that results in 6 elementary schools in the district. And so by having High Rock remain online as an elementary school, you can downsize the Mitchell project to a 3-section per grade school. And some students would remain in the High Rock facility upon the conclusion of this master plan. So the duration is the same, but the total cost for the entire master plan drops a little over $30 million to around $250 million. This also results, as we've talked about in previous meetings, as just a little bit of wiggle room in terms of total elementary capacity in the district. By having the 6th elementary school online, you would essentially have 6 classrooms to help keep the class sizes low in this scenario at the elementary grades, or have dedicated special space that doesn't currently exist in some of the elementary schools.
I got one question if you're ready, Jason.
Yes.
Okay. First is Natasha, then it's Steve. Natasha?
So the only thing that you would have to do to High Rock to keep it as an elementary school is the bathrooms. There's nothing else that's required for kindergarten or anything else?
So if it's not an MSBA project, our exploration has suggested that that's exactly right. That you can really nicely fit a 3-section elementary school in this building without taking on a major renovation project. There are going to be some things to pay attention to. Like the gym is going to remain, as a small gym. The cafeteria is going to remain a small cafeteria. There won't be dedicated toilets inside the kindergarten classrooms, but those features exist in other elementary schools in the district also. So it's not like it would be an outlier in sort of those three regards.
And my other question was, in general, for all of these, when you're talking about systems, it looks like we're going towards carbon neutral or net zero in general. Is any of that taken into account here as the state kind of moves into more energy efficient systems requirements?
We haven't included any premiums in the cost estimating algorithms for net zero energy or net zero water, net zero waste, any of those kinds of things. And if that's something that we need to fold into the cost estimating process, we certainly can. But right now, the only sort of sustainability features that are assumed are based on the MSBA practice of a LEED certified building plus a certain percentage over the baseline energy code.
We've been working on buildings where even though they're not net zero, they're net zero ready.
Right. So
it's just something to think about as we're moving forward, because the code is heading in that direction. So, just to keep it in mind, you don't have to, basically you want it to be electric. So,
right.
And it doesn't, you can purchase power or you can whatever. But just in general, to think about making sure that there's something related to that in here. Okay. Thanks.
If I could interject on the sustainability measures. You're absolutely right, Natasha. We are working on another elementary school right now where we're taking those into consideration. It's a 560 student elementary school, and we're seeing a premium of anywhere from 3 to 5 million, depending on the measures that you put in place.
Okay, great. And then Steve, question, and then followed. I got one by Roy as well.
Yeah, I just want to point out there is one important distinction here too. Mitchell here is a 3-section school. The previous scenario was a 5-section school. And a 3-section school at Mitchell, I think, is much more accommodating. It doesn't stress that site quite the way a 5-section school would have done it or would stress it. Considering the limited parking that's on site, I realize it's a walking school, but there's still issues with regard to the available space on that site. So that is something to consider here, that we do have a 3-section school. And we also parlayed that into a discussion internally that if we wind up with a 3-section school at Mitchell, that may be more viewed by MSBA as a carrot if we want to indeed try to bring them into the Pollard upgrade.
I know Roy's got a question, but before I do that, if I may cut in just quickly relative to what you just said, Steve. 3-section Mitchell just occurred to me. If we do a 3-section Mitchell, will that require some redistricting to balance out? I know that Pollard would pick up the 6th, but would we have to redistrict some stuff?
I think the assumption, Stuart, is that yes. Whether you build a 5-section Mitchell school or you pursue a 3-section Mitchell school, that at the very minimum, there would be some redistricting around the fringes necessary, or at least explored.
On all series?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Stuart, can I just say something on that?
Yes, go ahead, Sue.
I think that we're going to be looking at that anyway, because Elliott is, going to be bursting at the seams, and maybe Broadmeadow is getting there also. So there's just going to have to be some rethinking about the alignment of students in order to accommodate where there are higher growth areas in town as well.
Okay, and I just didn't know if that, it's just a statement. I just know if that would influence an angle toward the 5-section versus the 3-section, because you can cover more area, but I'll leave that for another spot. And I know if Roger, you could just take Steve's hand down. I believe we have Roy, and now we have Erwin as well. So I'll turn to Roy.
Thanks very much. So my question is how much is the operating difference with this model versus the previous one? I like this because it's $50 million less. It creates some smaller schools, but I don't know if that has a big impact on annual operating costs, which are going to add up over time. And I don't know that anybody can answer that today, but I'd be curious in making our decision to understand that.
So I think Dorn Whittier can only respond to that question from the sort of square footage point of view. Because there are capacity issues, the number of classrooms in each scenario is slightly different. So this scenario does result in more classrooms and slightly more square footage than the status quo scenario, because one whole school is coming offline. You're replacing that square footage of Pollard, but so there would be an operational difference, at least in terms of the number of elementary classrooms in the district in this scenario versus what you have today.
But then you have like are there other overhead issues like principals, vice principals, physical instructors and other things like that have to be added into the operating budget because now you're not on one site, you're on an additional site?
Stuart, if I may, by reallocating the High Rock School to an elementary school, you still have the same total number of schools within the district. However, you have 6 elementary and 1 middle school. So the staffing would really be up to the school department and whether they would, how they would do that. Yes, there might be some increased operating costs associated with principals, but also offsetting some of those costs is the enhanced ability to keep special needs students in district. And that, as we found out at Sonita, is a very important factor. Dan, maybe you want to comment any further on those?
I'm not sure that there's much more to add. We keep the inventory of buildings would be the same, and presumably we would be adding for enrollment growth, depending on what that looks like. So to answer the question, I don't think there would be significant increase in operating costs for staffing. The only thing, and Hank alluded to it, is if one of the things about the High Rock model that we discussed a few moments ago is the power of that model has allowed for some autonomy of the 6th grade as an introduction into the middle school. So I would probably recommend to the school committee that if we had a 6-8 Pollard project, that we'd think perhaps about a school within a school model that may have some different costs, for example, a principal or co-principal as we have now. So the operating costs for staffing, I think, would not be significant based on my understanding where we are right now.
Thanks, very helpful.
And Erwin has a question.
Yes, my question has to go with something Dan just said about enrollment, and it made me think of seeing the different projections of 3-section Mitchell and then 5-section Mitchell. Also made me think of Snita Williams, that when we were doing the design, we anticipated a certain amount of students, and there seemed to be a comfort of we had some additional capacity, and then when the school opened, we were kind of butting up against that additional capacity. So my question is, I don't know if it's captured somewhere in this analysis, but as you compare the different scenarios, is there a way to highlight in some way which scenario maybe has the most capacity, say for increased enrollment, or has the most flexibility to handle that?
Yeah,
I don't know if that's a qualifying description that you have somewhere.
We certainly have that information, Erwin, and we've talked a little bit about it in the past. The status quo scenario, for example, I would characterize that as a glove fit for the enrollment forecast that we've seen so far. In order to accommodate the enrollment projection, the Mitchell project needs to be a 5-section school. And so that would allow you to continue to operate within your current class size guidelines and satisfy the enrollment forecast as it exists. If the forecast were to go up, for example, there isn't a lot of wiggle room in this status quo without changing the class size to be higher sort of across the elementary district. In the High Rock as an elementary school scenario, by contrast, because there are 6 elementary schools, there would essentially be 6 additional general classrooms across the district that could either absorb, enrollment as it increases and not have to grow class size, or serve as dedicated things like Spanish or technology, where those things don't exist in some of the elementary schools today. So just in terms of raw classroom count, this scenario has a little more wiggle room than, for example, the previous 2 scenarios because of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erwin. Natasha has a
Yeah, I
question.
just have an additional question really quickly. Is there an inequity of having a school that is 3 section versus having the other ones be 5 sections? So does the town ever get any pushback on if this would be a 3-section school for the inequity?
Is that a Dan or is that a Sue question? Or is that you, Jason?
Well, I guess I would start by saying that in this scenario, the end result is Mitchell, Elliott, and High Rock would all be 3-section schools.
Okay.
So you would have parity among those 3 schools.
Okay.
You would have parity with Broadmeadow and Sunita Williams as 4-section schools, and Newman would be the only outlier at a 5-section school.
Okay. Thank you.
Dan or Sue, do you?
No, Jason captured it from my view. I assume may have something to add.
Nope, I agree. That's all I know.
Okay, thank you. I see no more questions. Do you want to continue, Jason?
Yep. So one last thing I'll mention about this scenario is we assumed that the Mitchell project would be the MSBA project simply because of the physical needs that it has and the fact that it has modulars there currently that are necessary. We could have a discussion about whether or not this scenario also works if the Pollard project were explored as the MSBA project. Obviously, it would be advantageous to the town if the MSBA participated in the more expensive project rather than the less expensive project. So that's a discussion that we can have in working group meetings as the study continues to move forward.
Is that assuming that the MSBA will never do 2 projects at the same time?
Historically, they have not participated in 2 projects in the same town at the same time.
Got it.
I know of one exception where it started out as a large middle school project and it ended up being 2 separate middle school projects on separate sites. But other than that, I don't know of any circumstances where they've done 2 different projects concurrently within their grant program. So the final scenario is the idea of converting Newman to a 5 through 8 and placing a small addition at Pollard to be a second 5 through 8. And I think just the graphic overview can alert you to that this is a fairly complex scenario to try to execute. So the key things here to realize is that in order to make this scenario work, both the Newman project and the Pollard project would have to be executed concurrently and occupied concurrently so that the Newman students can have a place to go, the elementary school students at Newman have a place to go when those 2 projects are finished. So you'll see that the Pollard project is assumed to be the MSBA project starting in February of 2021 and being occupied in the fall of 2026. The Newman project, because it's an addition and not MSBA, would follow starting in November of 2023 and concluding that same fall in 2026. The High Rock students would be moved into these 2 facilities. 5th grade would be pulled out of the elementary schools and moved into these 2 facilities. And then the Mitchell project would have to get started so that pre-K and the Newman students that aren't in 5th grade would have a home. So you see that we're assuming that the Mitchell project would be 3-section plus pre-K, starting that February before the Pollard and Newman projects are occupied and running until the fall of 2023. Because High Rock is being occupied largely by the Newman Elementary School students who were displaced by the middle school projects, it's not available to serve as swing space for the Mitchell project. So that warrants the need for a temporary elementary school project to house the Mitchell students during the construction of the Mitchell project. So again, the timing there is the same as the temporary project that occurred before, where the vote to fund the project has to coincide with the vote to fund the Mitchell project, and the temporary school has to be occupiable in time for construction to begin on the Mitchell project. So there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of coordination that would have to happen. And at the end of the day, it takes much longer to execute this plan, roughly 151 months, all the way out into the fall of 2023 at a fully escalated total cost of around $362 million. So at the end, you have 2 5 through 8 middle schools. You have Broadmeadow, Elliott, Williams continuing to be now K4 elementary schools. Mitchell is a pre-K 4 elementary school. High Rock is a K4 elementary school, and you'd have this temporary facility that would have to be partially decommissioned at the end of the master plan. So again, open it up for questions about this scenario.
Are either of these kinds of projects ones that lend themselves to support from MSBA? I mean, I can see a new Mitchell school, but shifting to a 5 to 8 for both Newman and Pollard. I'm not so sure that there would be a lot of support for them.
So there have been MSBA projects with unusual grade configurations. There are a handful that are 5 through 8. They would consider the 5th graders in their guidelines middle schoolers, though. So that, you know, they would follow the same guidelines for classroom size, for science, for music, for art as the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But there's nothing about that grade configuration that I think would hurt the possibility of MSBA participating in that project. Similarly, with the pre-K 4 grade configuration, we have even a project in our own portfolio that's an MSBA pre-K 4 elementary school.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Do you have a follow-up, George? Did you say?
Well, I think also
Steve?
the school committee had made it fairly clear when the earlier presentation to them was made that they are certainly not in favor of the 5 to 8 reconfiguration. And even though I question the need for the temporaries, because the other schools are all losing 1 grade, but given that, I think this scenario isn't proving to be, you know, it has a penalty financially. And as long as the Pollard site can take the expanded number of students, which, you know, we've been discussing over the last month or so, I think this scenario is just in for the mark, the fact that we've got it shown.
I agree. Okay, Sue?
I just want to support Steve's comment there. There was really no appetite from the school committee for changing the grade configuration this way, and clearly financially it does not seem to be a winning approach for the town. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Great. Go ahead, Dan.
I will just add that this very complicated project that will last till I'm about 87 years old, and I'm only 27 right now, is expensive. It would make the Newman campus tremendously large for a 5/8. I don't think there would be any school in the Commonwealth that would have such a large 5/8 program on one campus, further stressing the ability of that venue. In addition, it pushes Mitchell way off, which, by the way, is a project that would probably receive more interest by the MSBA before a Pollard project would. So for those reasons and everything that Sue has said and Steve, this just doesn't seem to have, I'm not sure it's the right way to go, and I think the school committee has expressed that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Steve, you mute. Thanks. Jason, you want to continue, or are you?
So just have one more sort of summary slide here. And at the outset, we had said that we have displayed the cost estimates in both 2020 dollars and in fully escalated dollars to the midpoint of construction for where each of the projects land in their sequence. So this is a summary of all 4 scenarios and all the projects that have been explored, with those 2020 dollars there being in the left-hand side of the timeline graphic. And you can just sort of look across and see, the level of escalation for each one of these, $50 million for the 7/8 reno at Pollard when it doesn't get occupied until the fall of 2023. Just to put into perspective how significant an impact the escalation can have on these master plan projects when they're planned so far in advance. So we've got the totals rolled up there, and you can see that the status quo scenario and the discontinue High Rock scenario are roughly the same total master plan cost. The High Rock as a 6th elementary school is the cheapest at around $208 million. And then the most expensive of the 4 scenarios, even before we escalate them, at around $280 million was the 2 5 through 8 scenario. So we can see if there's any questions about this final summary slide, but if not, we'll open it up to general questions.
I don't see any questions. And there's no attendees other than I think it's you, Roger, but I don't see any hand raised in the attendees.
So in terms of our next steps then, we still owe the committee the cost estimates for each of the individual school capital improvement lists, and those are on their way. We have started drafting the report, and in August or so, we hope to submit those draft and final reports. Michelle or Don, do you have anything to add as we close out the presentation?
I think we had said that we would issue the report in 2 sections, to the draft report in 2 sections. One being the piece that you just went through at the end of July. So we can begin those conversations with the MSBA. And then the second being the entire draft report, which would include the capital improvement cost estimates and the capital improvement spreadsheets as part of that final piece in August.
Any other questions, comments?
I'm going to, you don't mind if I say something controversial?
Sorry, George. I saw Dan's hands first.
That's okay. Dan.
This is very quick, and I'll get it in before George makes a controversial statement. Be careful, George. And it's this. I just want to repeat something I said at a previous meeting. I very much appreciate D&W's approach to this entire study, from the working group to these meetings. I have not attended these meetings. Sue and Ann have kind of done that, but the working group was thoughtful. I appreciate Michelle and Jason in particular for leading the 3 principals and staff and all of us through this. And the presentations that Jason and Michelle have presented, this is probably the first experience I've had where you've been able to visually see a timeline, a project, and cost estimates all on one slide for a scenario. And I think that's just again, you see this all the time. I don't. It's just immensely helpful to try to help the public digest it and understand it. And I appreciate it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I would second that. It's good stuff. George, you sure you want to be recording?
I'm gonna offer some thoughts just to think about this from the perspective of the average citizen in Needham. One thing that's somewhat scary is the size of these numbers are huge. They're bigger than any project that we've done as a town. Escalation not, even factored in. The largest project that nearly choked us is the current one with police and fire that we're doing now. But the fact is that some people out there believe that the model that's currently being used, why have we absolutely convinced ourselves there's no way to do any modification at High Rock to accommodate additional sixth graders there? Then look at Pollard only as a 7th and 8th and do the modifications necessary there to bring that up to speed, and then build a new Mitchell. Those numbers are probably going to be substantially lower than what we're showing in this report. So my question or my comment is that the average Needham, I think, is going to look at this and absolutely choke on these numbers, let alone FinCom. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, Dan, but I think the reality is that we probably have a bit of a sales job, not to say the least, looking forward to this, just to convince people that this isn't a wish list, but it's something that's absolutely necessary because there are no other alternatives. I've talked to people and they've said to me, why don't we just go in and see if we can find a way to make High Rock a little bigger? I said, well, it's not as easy as you think. To do that, it may not even be possible. So somehow I think in this whole process, we've got to overcome that issue in some people's mind that this is going to be the biggest thing the town of Needham has ever done. And it's going to be difficult to do it. That's a general thought that I have, and I hate to throw a monkey wrench into this, but I think I'm trying to identify some reality that is going to show up probably fairly quickly.
I'd just like to, before you go, Dan, but George, I think one thing that I see is that when you look at it just one chunk, I agree that it's not only a huge dollar and it's complex with a sequence, but if you break it down to its components, how different is that relative to the school projects we've done? If you look at the high school cost, look at other, each individual piece is not that different than I think some of what we've done. And if I'm misjudging that, then I apologize. But you break it down, it's just because it's collapsed into a short time frame, so to speak. Look at all the projects we've done over the last 20 years, especially from the schools, right?
Oh yeah.
But I think it's only just because it's compressed and have to be put together. But if you had a bigger timeline and separated them out, is that more palatable? But it's still, you're gonna have to end up spending something on that.
George, I'd like to just break down what you said, and I think that what you're looking at, if I understood your comments correctly, is the status quo option. And that status quo option puts an addition onto High Rock for grade 6 to deal with the overcrowding. It renovates Pollard to deal with some of the issues that are going on there. And then in the enrollment projections, it requires a 5-section school. And whether that's an addition or renovation an addition renovation to get there or a new school, I think you would find that a new school would probably at the end of the day be less expensive than trying to renovate the Metro school. So I think if I understood your question correctly, it really is that status quo piece of this. And those numbers do reflect a more costly than the option 4, but certainly not as costly as some of the other options.
It's closer to that, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, and I was going to say that the status quo model does get to that. The other thing, just stepping back from all of these pieces, because I know I get lost in them, we have to remember that this facility study was to help also solve, or was to primarily drive, enrollment in the Needham Public Schools. Sue mentioned earlier, we have an issue with enrollment at Elliott and at Broadmeadow. The project, one or two of them, I know there's one that I think, for example, the High Rock as an elementary school project, for example, solves the problem and provides capacity for elementary enrollment in the community. And it also provides some efficiencies at the middle school level that don't exist right now, as Sue had pointed out earlier. So George is right. The sticker shock is pretty amazing, and there's a story that has to be told there, and ultimately the community will have to decide. But one or two of these, I believe, really help solve the broader enrollment issues that we're dealing with for a long time to come. So I'll leave it at that.
If I could just add one more comment, and I'm not sure how this is being driven by the town, but I think that any kind of growth in terms of apartment units over and above where we currently are really needs to be thought about carefully and how that it potentially affects the schools. Because if we continue to allow that part of the town government to say, okay, let's build this apartment complex here and this apartment complex there, we'll add more and that'll help with the tax base. But the problem is that it creates more problem for us in terms of school enrollments, which eventually has to be solved. And so I frankly think it's kind of a short-sighted approach to growth as a town. I know that sounds a little like anti-growth, but the reality is you can't just allow indiscriminate growth in the town without paying attention to the reality that you're going to have to pay sooner or later. And more than likely, because we've done such a great job with our school system and with our school buildings, et cetera, in town, people are going to want to come here. And so we've got to be careful to blend the whole growth scenario of the town with the growth scenario of the school system.
Question, hands up from Richard.
Yeah, just to add or kind of my own take on what George has said, I agree in principle with what he has said about the need to manage growth. However, I would point out that the apartment complexes that have come online really were driven by the 40B issue and not just growth for the sake of growth. That doesn't mean that there aren't projects on the table, things that are being looked at by the town and potential development elsewhere. But I don't think you're going to see it at the same pace that we've seen it to this point. Again, it was driven in large part, as I understand it, by the need to kind of manage the 40B situation, which was getting out of hand.
Yeah, we've gone far beyond that though, Richard. But anyway, that's another issue to be discussed in a different meeting. My point is, we've got to be careful, and the message has to get across to our town leaders that they've got to be very careful in their growth plans to make sure that schools and the growth of schools has to be considered. We can't keep adding new schools and building them, and as soon as we open them, they're overcrowded. It just, Sunita Williams is a great example of that. But anyway, just me getting on my soapbox. Sorry about that.
Thanks, George. Roger, can you please add Jean Volution back into the panel?
I agree with what George said, but at the same time, there's a really huge need, especially with COVID and all the issues that we're having in the state economically for affordable housing. So I wouldn't, I would keep that in mind, that it could still be a possibility.
No, we've already met the requirements for affordable housing in town.
But they may be changing is what I'm saying.
George, the other thing that I think the analysis pointed out was that the teardowns are contributing a large number of students that are coming in at all grade levels. And so as you tear down an empty nester house and replace it with a 5-bedroom house with 2.5 or 3 kids that are already of school age, that has, and you have between 100 and 200 of those every year, which we have for the past decade.
Losing you, Hank?
Oh.
Give it a second for the IP burp to reconnect. You there, Hank?
That's what happened to me.
Did we lose Hank? While we're waiting for Hank, I do agree with the teardowns, but the any other Gene? Did you have a question or a comment?
I guess as a part of the teardown community, I guess I can contribute to that a little bit. So we're definitely seeing a huge spike in interest right now, and I would say over the last month or so, we've had a lot more increase than ever before, and it's just really a carbon copy. Like if you look at the family composition, it's exactly carbon copy. It's younger family trying to move from Boston or somewhere in a city. They're trying to move to suburbs. They usually either expecting a child or they have a child, children anywhere from 2 to 5 year old. And these are all the children that are going to be going to school in just several years. And the volume of increase that I have absolutely no lots to meet the demand.
That's phenomenal.
So and I think, in my opinion, as a builder, I can see the trend since a lot of areas are already, they've been turned over, they've been rebuilt. I think, in my opinion, the next big wave is going to be in the Needham Heights area, because that's where the only stock of smaller homes that we have, the leftover.
Hank, I think you're back on. Did you want to finish off your comment? He's still on mute. So with that, I'm going to assume there's no more comments. Does anybody else have other comments? Can we wrap this up? And just confirm the next steps here. I think we did.
Stuart, it looks like Hank's back on.
I'm sorry, Natasha?
It looks like Hank's back on and he's unmuted.
He is, you're right. Hank, you there? Did you want to finish up your comment, Hank?
I think he froze again.
All right. So anyways, and I wish Hank could be back because he has to help wrap up, or Steve Popper, if you could cover anything that we need to wrap up relative to this section, or Jason.
I think we are at the close of this discussion. I think the next steps, aside from the production of the report, is incumbent again on the school dialogue with the MSBA. We had talked about initiating a dialogue, identifying what we have done once the report is in hand, or at least the first phase of that report, so that we can start the whole dialogue with MSBA on the the realism of getting a project or 2 projects into the into the queue. So that's a discussion that Dan's going to have with the school committee. And I see it as a discussion with MSBA before the end of the summer.
All right, great. With that, we'll close this topic, this agenda item down, and we'll move to other business. Before we do, I'd like to say thanks to the EW folks, Don, Jean, Michelle, others, and the working group. Certainly, I think this has been very good. And we'll go from there. Hank, I see you on. Is there anything you needed to add, or are we all set to close this out?
Nothing further, just thank you for your comments.
Okay.
And if there are more detailed comments, please email them to me.
Okay. All right, great. All right, thank you very much. That topic is now closed. We do have some voting items relative to the public safety building, as well as the high school expansion. And I'm going to put those forward now. And then I just have two, hopefully, quick topics, but awareness topics I think that's important to share with the committee. But first on the invoices, for the public safety, I would like to put forth 4 invoices and group them together. And if there's any issues, please let me know. But first, there's an invoice for Intrasystems Building Management System for $11,925. Invoice for Town of Dover for police detail for $400. Town of Needham for a police detail of $984. And Town of Needham for police detail of $1,023.50. I'd like to put forth those 4 invoices for payment approval. Do I hear a second?
Second.
George, thank you. Any questions? Hearing none, coming to the vote. Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Erwin?
Aye.
Roy?
Aye.
Jean?
Aye.
Natasha?
Aye.
Stewart's an aye. Okay. One more invoice. It's the high school expansion. It is an invoice for Walter Specialties window shades for $3,517. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Thank you, Erwin. Any questions? Hearing none, coming to a vote. Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Erwin?
Aye.
Roy?
Aye.
Jean?
Aye.
Nastasha?
Aye.
Stewart's an aye. Okay, great. That does it for invoices. Catherine, I don't think there's anything else. From looking at the list, is there anything else that's lurking?
No,
Okay.
nothing else.
All right, so that closes out. There's only 2 other topics, and Steve Popper, I just thought it would make sense as you and I spoke, just to bring awareness to the 2 topics. One is the soil fire station 2, and then just the topic from this morning from an awareness standpoint. You okay with me bringing those up?
I'm sorry, yes.
Okay, so the first topic, I just want everybody to be aware, I think some of you heard it from the last meeting, and for those that you were not in attendance, Fire Station 2, along one piece of the foundation, has found some dirty soil. An inspector, boy, if I got this right, Steve, an LSP was brought in to evaluate, and since we last met, there's actually seems to be a little bit more area and a little bit more concern of what needs to be done. So the next committee meeting, I think there'll be a bigger discussion around the consequence or the significance of it. It will be a more costly item on the anticipated cost log. It was $100,000 that we were carrying. I believe that number will increase. How much? We don't know, but maybe Steve can elaborate a little bit further. But all I wanted you to be aware of is that it's a concern. It's there. we're going to have to, we hope to have more information on the next meeting and get more clarity on the cost and what the remediation will be. Steve, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's, you said it. The scope is more acute than we had spoke to at the last meeting. Where we do have groundwater, we have a frac tank coming to filter out the water that we have to excavate and backfill the hole. And the hole is apparently the extent of the contaminated soils is deeper than we thought, which added another layer of cost. So.
And it also touches a foundation, so there's consideration there. But again, I think we'll wait for Ken and team to come back with a more explicit understanding of it. One, just make everybody aware of that.
Yeah, we're actually hopeful, Stu, that by the next meeting, we will have actually completed the activity. But in the interim, we are spending upwards of twice what the numbers that we presented last week.
Yep. And also there is a timeline impact. There was the last meeting we stated that I think it was the June 22nd, we would possibly be moving forward, but there's an additional delay because of the greater scope. The specific delay in time, again, will come next meeting, I hope. Okay. With that, the only other topic is the fence along the, oh boy, I wanted to say the eastern side of from Lincoln Street into the fire headquarters. Steve raised a concern with the difference in height between the parking lot that is the main parking lot there for, as you know, the back of CVS, Hearth, and the Middlesex Bank there, that abuts up against the fire headquarters lot. There's a difference in height between the parking lot and the entranceway from Lincoln Street, and the fence that goes in there. Everything was designed accordingly, but there seems to be a greater height and potentially a concern with the when the fence goes in, debris and everything else. Steve and I met with Ken this morning on the site to look at it. There's nothing conclusive right now, but maybe Steve, if you want to just bring a little bit more clarity to that for the board.
Yeah, we actually met later in the afternoon with the landscape architect, Dave McKinley, and we determined that bringing up a retaining wall behind the curb made the most sense, and leaving the fence itself, the decorative fence. So in essence, we're, rather than dipping 2.5 feet from existing to the top of the curb, we're going to be basically having a level area of soil and grass or shrubbed buffer area before we get to the fence, which I think is a better design. It will avoid the concerns that we had, but it is going to add some pricing to the project. We're looking at the numbers. We don't have that yet, but we're probably looking in the order of $50,000. And the reason I say that, I know there was an earlier number that was thrown out, Stuart. We determined that the extent of that wall is somewhat, we can limit it to the east-west, in the east-west direction on the access way. We do not need to come all the way around back by the
Building.
the dumpster area. But still, we are going to be incurring a change in plans, and we'll have to go in front of we'll have to submit that to the planning board.
Yeah. And I think that if people are interested, we can send a diagram out. But again, I think what we do is once we get enough information, the next meeting, we can bring a more clear perspective on the situation along with the diagrams. George?
So the natural question to ask at this point, I'll ask it for Erwin because I know he's wondering about it as I am. What does that do, Steve, to your comfort level with the contingency? I know we were somewhat concerned about it before, and now we've got a couple of items, one of which is still unknown, the work at the Heights Fire Station, plus this one. What does this do to your level of concern for the contingency number now? Are you still okay with it?
My reaction is that yes, I believe we're still have enough maneuverability to handle additional surprises that are likely to come forward. But I'm not, yes, I don't think, I feel we're in a zone where we need to panic in terms.
We just lost $250,000 in essence.
Well, yeah, 150 plus 50 is 200, but we have other issues that creep into the anticipated log as we move forward. Yeah, it's bringing us closer to $1 million when we're all done, and I anticipate we'll see something closer to $1 million next review period. I still think that's a healthy margin. I still bank on it that many of the design issues we encountered are issues that have already been costed into our pricing because they were issues that were identified before that carried to the design that KBA has produced and were handled with change orders at that time. So, I still am comfortable, and
okay, that's why I asked the question.
Okay, and I think it's fair probably once we get more information, maybe to revisit that. But I think that the number's a lot less, Steve, than we talked about earlier, which is good. But I think the way I see it, when the issue first came up and I went and looked at it and then had a chance to talk to Steve and Ken on site today, I feel this issue, some aggravation occurs if we don't do it, if we don't follow through and change. But I think this is a long-term building, and this is something I think that I think we got to work hard to see if we can do it. And I just don't see how, I'd hate to not do it. I hate not to fix the problem.
correct.
Steve, this is Natasha. Do we have unit pricing for a lot of these things, or is this, especially for any earthwork or anything that is accruing these large numbers? Do we have unit pricing that at least we can control the cost?
Well, the large number is removing soils, and we have quantities and unit price that build up to those builds up an estimate of what the cost is.
Right, but at least you have unit prices, so it's not like they're going rogue on giving you numbers. You actually have these prices already set.
For the remediation, yes. We're still somewhat working the cost of the development of this fence issue. But it will be built up from unit cost.
Yeah, it will be. Erwin, I apologize. I know you had your hand up.
That's okay. It would be easier, I think, for me to ask this question if I could visually see what the fence issue was, but I'm just curious.
Let me see if I can bring up the diagram while you're talking.
Yeah, I guess my question is, what led to this issue coming about?
Oh, we
have an elevation change issue? Yeah.
The spot grades that the architect had assumed when he did the work came off of some site survey work, and he had assumed that the drop would only be in the order of 12 inches, and he was willing to, he was a gentle slope between the existing parking lot and the driveway curb. That difference in height actually started to get, it was in excess of 2 feet. And it would have provided a dip that really wasn't, would have developed a poor design, a poor outcome. And that just didn't work.
Roger, am I able to broadcast or present? Yes, there it is.
Yeah, you should be able to, yeah.
Yep, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you guys. I just was going to show you quickly. Can you see that, Steve and Erwin?
Yes.
Okay. So, Steve, I'll let you talk to it.
Yeah, well, what the architect had assumed at that point is the difference between the existing parking and the curb was in the order of 12 to 18 inches. Even then, it would have been, and the original design is where the fence is, as Stuart has circled, right behind the curb. When you looked at it, that difference in elevation actually appears to be closer to 30 inches, 2 foot to 24 inches to 30 inches. So it creates a dip that is just a poor design coming off the existing pavement, off the existing parking area. So our intentions are to actually raise behind that curb, put in a blocked wall that will raise the elevation so that, in essence, the grade change is the same or equal across, and you provide a buffer so that cars have that buffer before the fence is, and there's no debris that's
right in here
that collects within that wedge.
Yeah, right in here is the problem.
The alternative was to move the fence up to the upper lot, which is the right-hand sketch. And the problem with that is you've got cars parking right against it. You're going to, you have the potential for damaging that, that area. Plus it creates a problem in that there is conduit that's buried below the, right behind the light poles.
But it's
and
right here, actually.
Exposed, all of that has to be exposed because the augering of the posts is in close proximity. So it gets into a fairly complicated process for construction. So we believe the best, the fence should be located where it was originally shown.
Which is raised.
It will entail putting a short retaining wall behind that curb to lift up the soil and create that that buffer, grass buffer area.
So what caused all of this? The landscape architect screwed up?
No, well, first of all, we have had limited observation on site for 3 months. So getting to
From
it
the architect, right?
from the architect.
Otherwise, supervision would be good across the board.
And we really didn't try to deal with this until we started placing the light post foundations and the curbing in. And then it became apparent that were we going ahead with the intent of the original design, we would have created that wedge. And that wedge is just an awful impediment to, you know, an appropriate design to leave this project with.
Steve, but this is a civil engineering issue, not an architectural issue. So has the civil engineer discussed all of this with you guys?
Well, it's a landscape detail.
I guess it's a landscape detail, but it's not an architectural detail.
Landscape
Well,
architect.
the landscape architect is part of the
Okay.
architectural design team.
And so the landscape architect is the one that hasn't been out there to look at it until recently.
Right.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I thought you were saying the architect hadn't been out there, but I'm like, the architect wouldn't have mattered. It's civil and landscape.
Well, but isn't the responsibility of the architect overall? KVA overall?
Well, they're the prime, but I mean, they have to, you know, the civil and the landscape go out there at key moments, right? So if they weren't alerted to come out, or if, you know, with COVID, it's a little complicated because of people's insurance, what they're doing. But yeah, the architect is the prime, but in general, this is something that's reviewed by the landscape and the civil. So that's why I was asking, like, even if the architect went out there, they may not know that detail because that's not their, you know, that's not.
You're right, Natasha. In this case, the landscape architect actually works with KBA. They're part of KBA. They're
Got it. Okay.
part of KBA, not a sub.
And they knew that this was going on and they just couldn't go out because of their
Well, they didn't.
requirements?
I think they didn't realize the actual condition until it was cleaned up and the curb was set and the light post foundations went in. You didn't really understand how that detail was coming together.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. So I think in the interest of time and where we are, I just want to make sure those two items were brought up. I think we can have a little bit more of a conversation next time. And if there's any questions in the interim, certainly we can contact Steve, and I'm sure him and Ken will be sending us more information, but hopefully we set the stage for you know, a discussion, and that this wouldn't blindside anybody. Okay. All right. I know we're past the time. Is there any other open issues, any other topics we need to cover tonight in our meeting? Okay, I don't see anything. All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate tonight and participation, and we'll go from there. Thank you, Roger, very much for sticking through our meeting and helping out. Hopefully I can maybe take over next time and save you an evening.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Catherine? Everybody else can leave, but Catherine, do you want to connect up tomorrow?
Yes.
Invoices?
Yes, I'd like to be able to drop them off in the morning or sometime if there's
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. I have a window at between 10 and 11, or anywhere after 11:30 till 2. I just let me know and I'll be ready and I can sign.
Okay, well, let's plan on 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock.